Could it be that an international trade dispute over French brandy was the true catalyst that accidentally plunged the largest city in Europe into decades of intoxicating chaos? We step quietly back into the dimly lit and deeply bustling cobblestone streets of early 1700s London. It is a massive city, overflowing with both unprecedented immense wealth and truly unimaginable hardship. The thick city air is heavy with dark coal smoke and the sharp scent of crushed juniper. It is so genuinely wonderful to have you joining us on another deeply immersive journey into the past. Please consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel if you enjoy these long, deep dives into history. It truly helps us grow and reach more history lovers. I am always deeply fascinated by exactly how far our historical stories travel across the globe. I would absolutely love it if you took a quick moment. Let me know in the comments where in the world you are listening from tonight. What exact time is it for you right now as you listen? For now, simply settle in deeply and pull your warm blankets just a little bit closer. Let the busy and loud modern world completely fade away as we travel safely back to the Georgian era. Welcome to Sleeping Scribe, where calming history stories help you unwind and gently fall asleep. Tonight, we smoothly transition away from our cozy, welcoming environment. We travel directly into the royal courts of 1689. A brand new king is just about to completely change the drinking habits of an entire nation. William of Orange confidently took the English throne in the year 1689. This monumental historical event became widely known as the Glorious Revolution. He was a deeply pragmatic and formidable leader. He was already serving as the stadtholder of the Dutch Republic. When he crossed the treacherous sea, he brought many unique Dutch cultural influences. These new customs flowed directly into the heart of England. A fierce and deeply unyielding political rivalry existed during this tumultuous time. It was a bitter military contest between William III and King Louis XIV of France. The heavy, velvet-draped halls of the English Parliament echoed constantly with anger. They rang with loud and passionate anti-French rhetoric from ambitious politicians. The politicians were angry. In 1689, the English government made a highly drastic economic decision. They officially enacted a strict and uncompromising embargo against all French imports. This was a massive and jarring shift in the daily life of wealthy citizens. Rich French brandy and exquisite French wine had been incredibly popular for decades. They were the primary spirits consumed by the English middle and upper classes. This was the comfortable and luxurious reality just prior to the new embargo. The sudden lack of these fine foreign spirits created an enormous market vacuum. It resulted in a massive and completely untapped domestic demand for strong, hard liquor. The market was hungry. The sight of empty wooden casks on the London docks became a melancholic scene. These massive oak barrels had once held the absolute finest aged cognac. Now they simply sat dry and hollow in the cool and damp morning air. The damp, salty breeze of the English Channel swept over the abandoned wood. Far out at sea, aggressive naval blockades fiercely kept the French merchant ships at bay. To fill the sudden void, the traditional Dutch spirit, Geneva, was enthusiastically introduced. It was a highly potent malt wine spirit, strongly flavored with crushed juniper berries. It quickly became a highly popular alternative, heavily promoted by William's own royal court. The simple word gin is actually just a casual English abbreviation. It evolved quite naturally from the original Dutch word Genever. The sharp, piney aroma of Dutch Genever poured freely from heavy, rustic earthenware jugs. The sharp clinking of ornate silver goblets rang out loudly in the opulent royal court. The wealthy aristocracy eagerly and greedily embraced the exciting new Dutch drink. The strict trade embargo was carefully designed to severely weaken the powerful French economy. It was also strategically meant to rapidly boost domestic English industries and agriculture. Before this new era, distillation in England was a tightly controlled and exclusive craft. The Worshipful Company of Distillers held a strict and ancient monopoly over the entire practice. They alone dictated who could legally make spirits and exactly how the process was done. The sudden absence of French wine and brandy left a massive hole in the economy. The English people were incredibly thirsty and desperate for a strong alternative. From the high-level decrees of the king, the story naturally flows downward. The ambitious Parliament realized they needed to heavily incentivize the common English citizen. They desperately wanted the everyday people to fill this new and highly profitable void. The nation was thirsty. The stage was finally set for a massive change. The Distilling Act of 1690 completely broke the ancient monopoly. The London Guild of Distillers permanently lost their exclusive and highly guarded power. Any ordinary English citizen was now legally permitted to freely distill spirits. The rules had changed. They could use domestic English grain to make their own cheap alcohol. They only had to give a simple 10 days' notice to the local excise board. The loud rustle of parliamentary parchment filled the crowded chambers of government. These new and completely deregulated laws were aggressively signed into immediate effect. The government eagerly offered lucrative corn bounties to the agricultural workers. This controversial policy effectively subsidized the widespread export and daily use of grain. Grain prices were artificially kept incredibly high by the calculating state government. This aggressive economic manipulation greatly benefited the wealthy aristocratic landowners. It also heavily favored the powerful Tory politicians who owned massive rural estates. The English agricultural sector was fortunately experiencing a period of exceptionally high yields. There was a massive and unprecedented surplus of grain across the entire country. The booming, dusty interior of a massive English granary was a very common sight. These huge wooden buildings were filled to the absolute brim with surplus barley and wheat. Distilling provided a highly profitable and incredibly easy way to use this excess up. It was a completely perfect solution for utilizing very low-quality grain. This specific ruined grain was totally unsuitable for brewing fine beer or baking good bread. The metallic clink of cheap copper coins echoed loudly in the busy outdoor markets. Dirty money quickly exchanged hands for massive bushels of this terrible, low-grade grain. Money changed hands quickly. The taxes on domestically produced spirits were purposefully set incredibly low. They were kept much lower than the heavy taxes on imported goods or even simple ale. By the year 1720, a shocking transformation had fully taken place. Thousands of private homes in London had eagerly set up their own distilling operations. They built crude and highly dangerous makeshift stills right in their own kitchens. Many more hid these bubbling contraptions down in their dark, damp basements. The intense and completely suffocating heat emanated constantly from these cramped underground cellars. Crude copper pot stills bubbled and hissed violently away through the day and night. The process of making this very early gin was incredibly rudimentary and careless. It very often resulted in a deeply harsh and highly toxic liquid output. The concoction was lethal. The harsh, burning smell of raw, volatile alcohol fumes completely filled the stagnant air. These highly flammable fumes leaked constantly from poorly sealed and cheap distillation pipes. The economic incentive to distill at home was incredibly strong and deeply seductive.
It was so remarkably powerful that it shifted the entire agricultural focus of the nation. Desperate farmers moved rapidly away from vital food production to grow grain specifically for spirits. The entire nation seemed entirely focused on creating as much alcohol as possible. Making this cheap gin was incredibly easy and brought in fast cash. Having finally established how gin became incredibly cheap and easy to make, we must transition. We must closely examine the grim, environmental reality of the growing city of London. These incredibly harsh and unforgiving conditions made drinking the cheap spirit a tragic daily necessity. Between the years 1600 and 1700, London's overall population exploded massively. The number of desperate people living there roughly tripled in size over a short century. The sprawling city rapidly surpassed 500,000 densely packed residents. London quickly became the absolute largest and fastest-growing city in all of Western Europe. But the city's ancient medieval infrastructure was entirely unequipped for this sudden heavy burden. It could not possibly handle the massive and chaotic influx of hopeful rural migrants. Poor people flocked to the dirty city, looking for steady work and a better life. There was absolutely no modern or safe sewage system in place anywhere. Human and animal waste flowed openly and freely in the shallow street gutters. The smell was overpowering. This foul and dangerous sludge moved incredibly slowly toward the main river. The acrid and deeply nauseating stench of open gutters was completely overpowering everywhere. It mingled constantly with the heavy and choking coal smoke from a million tiny fires. This dark and toxic smoke permanently blanketed the city sky in a thick gray haze. The River Thames was the absolute primary source of drinking water for the desperate mass, but it was heavily and tragically polluted with toxic industrial runoff from the city. Filthy tanneries and bloody slaughterhouses dumped their raw waste directly into the flowing river. The dark, murky, and incredibly slow-moving waters of the Thames were completely choked. They were densely filled with floating garbage debris and terrible rotting refuse. Drinking this completely untreated water in London was incredibly dangerous and often foolish. The water was poison. It frequently and inevitably led to highly deadly diseases like severe dysentery and cholera. Weak beer and traditional ale had long been the only safe alternative to dirty water. The intense boiling process of brewing effectively killed the harmful and invisible bacteria. But the newly invented gin was much stronger and far more intoxicating than simple beer. It was also significantly and dangerously cheaper to buy in large daily quantities. Gin did not ever spoil or go bad over long periods of time. This unique trait made it a highly reliable and completely stable household commodity. The global climate event known as the Little Ice Age contributed to harsh freezing winters. The biting freezing chill of a brutal London winter wind was absolutely terrifying. It cut right through the thin and ragged woolen clothes of the desperate working class. The artificial warming effect of strong gin became highly desirable to the freezing poor. It provided a fleeting and deeply necessary moment of comfort in the bitter cold. The deafening cacophony of heavy iron-rimmed cartwheels was a constant roaring noise. They clattered loudly and endlessly over the uneven and filthy muck-covered cobblestones. Overcrowded and dangerous tenements were the sad daily reality for the massive urban poor. Dozens of exhausted people lived together in miserable and extremely cramped living conditions. They desperately sought any possible escape from their bleak and exhausting daily lives. People sought escape. Heavy intoxication offered a very brief and welcome respite from the endless, overwhelming misery. The warm, temporary flush of heat in the chest was always eagerly welcomed. They felt it immediately after swallowing a fiery measure of cheap street gin. And so, with the grim urban environment fully established, we must now introduce the specific product. This dangerous and highly intoxicating product emerged directly from these very grim environmental conditions. It was the infamous and highly destructive spirit known simply as Madame Geneva. 18th century London gin was absolutely not a refined or elegant beverage. It was absolutely nothing like the perfectly smooth London dry we know and love today. It was a completely different and far more dangerous and unhinged concoction. It was very often flavored with toxic turpentine instead of fresh natural juniper berries. This highly dangerous substitution was done simply to save a few precious pennies. It created a deeply harsh and heavily woody taste that severely burned the tongue. Dangerous sulfuric acid was also occasionally added directly to the raw chemical mixture. This shocking addition gave the incredibly cheap spirit an artificial and highly painful kick. It created a deep burning sensation in a sensitive throat and empty stomach. It burned the throat. The sticky, sweet, and heavily chemical smell of turpentine completely filled the thick city air. Raw and unrefined alcohol fumes successfully masked the foul scent of the dirty city streets. The strange drink quickly earned a highly popular and anthropomorphic nickname among the poor. The desperate people affectionately called it by the gentle name Madame Geneva. Other highly colorful and deeply tragic street names quickly emerged among the struggling working class. They boldly called it Strip Me Naked, and they called it the Ruin. It was also widely known as Blue Ruin, and even openly mocked as parliamentary brandy. Cheap refined sugar and highly fragrant rosewater were sometimes added by the cunning sellers. This was a desperate and clever attempt to mask the foul taste of the toxic impurities. The thick syrupy consistency of heavily sweetened and inferior spirit was highly distinct. It clung thickly and slowly to the side of a dirty glass or pewter cup. This cheap gin was sold practically everywhere across the massive and sprawling city. It was absolutely not just found in traditional busy taverns or simple local pubs. You could easily buy a large cup in ordinary grocers and chandlers and local barbershops. Even wandering street hawkers peddled the potent and highly dangerous liquid from small dirty wheelers. A crudely and hastily painted wooden sign often hung directly above a small grocer's door. It simply depicted a rough gin barrel to clearly signal its steady and cheap availability. The chaotic and highly vibrant chorus of loud street vendors echoed down in the dark alleys. They shouted their many colorful nicknames for the potent spirit to attract eager buyers. Greedy employers frequently paid a large part of their exhausted workers' wages in pure gin. They happily handed out cheap toxic alcohol rather than paying them with actual valuable currency. The poor were desperate. The rough and cold texture of a small cheap pewter dram cup was deeply familiar. It was passed quickly from hand to hand in a dark and damp city alleyway. It was genuinely believed by some of the uneducated poor to have magical medicinal properties. They foolishly thought it easily cured everything from painful gout to the deadly plague. By the year 1730, the entire situation had escalated wildly and dangerously out of control. It was officially estimated that 1 in every 4 ordinary houses sold cheap gin. This shocking and horrifying statistic was especially true in the deeply poor and overcrowded St. Giles district. As we watch the first dark signs of this historical storm gathering over London, I am curious, what other moments of rapid social change or urban history would you like us to explore in a future video? Let me know down in the comments section below. I absolutely love reading your ideas and crafting stories around what fascinates you most. But for now, let us gently follow the winding streets deeper into the heart of the crisis.
Within this sprawling maze of urban poverty, a new kind of economy began to desperately flourish. Ingenious and completely unregulated methods of selling the potent spirit rapidly emerged on every single corner. The parish of St. Giles in the Fields quickly became London's most notorious and dangerous slum. It was a place of extreme desperation and profound daily misery. The wealthy and comfortable citizens of London widely referred to this dreadful place as a rookery. The complex architecture of St. Giles was a chaotic and deeply confusing maze of blind alleys. It was completely filled with decaying wooden tenements and utterly unlit, dangerous courtyards. The oppressive darkness of a narrow, winding St. Giles alley was truly overwhelming. Sunlight absolutely never reached the muddy and filth-covered ground in these hidden spaces. A massive influx of desperately poor Irish immigrants arrived steadily during this tumultuous historical period. They were tragically fleeing severe poverty and terrible crop failures in their beautiful homeland. These exhausted and terrified travelers desperately sought any safe refuge they could possibly find. They inevitably settled deep within the crowded and dangerous boundaries of the St. Giles rookery. They brought rich cultural traditions and desperate quiet hopes to a deeply broken place. Unemployment and severe underemployment were completely rampant and unavoidable across the entire dirty district. There was simply no steady or reliable work available for the massive, uneducated crowds. Many desperate people relied entirely on dangerous daily labor or endless, humiliating scavenging. Tiny, damp rooms in the sprawling rookery were very often rented strictly by the night. These miserable spaces sometimes housed dozens of exhausted people in a single tiny underground cellar. The constant loud creaking of rotting wooden floorboards echoed through the deeply overcrowded buildings. There was absolutely no ventilation in these terrible and suffocating tenement rooms. The air was thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and terrible, lingering disease. The hollow and deeply echoing sound of a distant church bell tolled constantly. It rang out mournfully over the chaotic and terrifying hum of the massive rookery. Gin quickly provided a remarkably cheap and completely accessible source of necessary daily calories. It was eagerly consumed by those who simply could not ever afford adequate nutritional food. A penny could buy enough strong gin to completely numb the painful bite of deep hunger. The tragic infant mortality rate in impoverished areas like St. Giles absolutely skyrocketed. It was a time of immense sorrow and quiet weeping for countless young mothers. Less than 25% of all poor children managed to survive to age 5. The bitter, freezing cold seeped constantly through painfully broken tenement window panes. These sharp, jagged holes were desperately stuffed with dirty old rags to block the terrible wind. Traditional and vital communal support systems completely fractured and broke apart. They collapsed heavily under the immense and crushing pressure of extreme poverty and widespread addiction. Crime rates surged violently as desperate individuals stole daily to fund their fierce chemical dependency. The streets became incredibly dangerous. The desperate, grasping hands of a hungry beggar were a deeply common and tragic sight. They huddled constantly in every damp, muddy doorway, seeking a single copper coin. The wealthy elite of London absolutely never ventured into these dangerous and impoverished districts. This created an incredibly stark and deeply profound physical and cultural divide in the great city. The rich lived in bright, grand squares, while the poor suffered in dark, hidden alleys. The inescapable presence of hawkers meant that absolutely no demographic was left untouched. This led to a profoundly devastating impact on the most vulnerable members of Georgian society. Because of its incredibly low cost, gin was easily sold by thousands of eager people. They were completely unlicensed and deeply itinerant street hawkers roaming the dirty city streets. Hawkers very often sold cheap gin directly from rough wooden wheelbarrows in the busy market. Some set up tiny makeshift stalls on busy, chaotic street corners. Many simply sold the fiery liquid from small, hidden clay flasks concealed in their heavy coats. The sly and deeply knowing grin of a cunning street vendor was everywhere. They quickly hid their forbidden flasks beneath thick, heavy woolen cloaks when constables passed. To cleverly bypass the early and strict licensing laws, incredible urban ingenuity rapidly emerged. An illicit and highly creative seller named Dudley Bradstreet invented a truly brilliant mechanical device. He built the famous Puss and Mew machine in the year 1738. This clever contraption is widely considered to be the world's first known functional vending machine. It was a brilliantly simple wooden sign carved carefully into the shape of a street cat. This wooden cat was placed strategically in a low, dark ground floor window. A thirsty patron would simply drop a rough coin directly into the cat's wooden mouth. The heavy clinking of a rough copper coin dropping into the wooden slot echoed loudly. The patron would then lean very close and softly say the word "puss." The conspiratorial and quiet whisper of "puss" was murmured into the damp, freezing air. It drifted through the quiet and intensely watchful alleyway. If the hidden operator inside the house had gin, they would quickly reply with the word "mew." The sudden and incredibly sharp hiss of raw gin would immediately follow the secret signal. The potent liquid flowed quickly down a crude hidden lead pipe into a waiting pewter cup. The pipe cleverly emerged directly from the wooden cat's painted paw. This completely anonymous transaction was an incredibly brilliant and successful evasion tactic. It actively prevented the many government informants from ever identifying the illegal seller. They could not report the hidden vendor to the angry and frustrated authorities. Bradstreet quickly made a very small and completely illegal fortune from this brilliant, clever invention. He gathered countless coins before the slow authorities eventually caught on to his clever trick. Informants who eagerly reported these illegal gin sellers were highly despised by the poor community. They were considered terrible traitors to the desperately struggling working class. These hated informants were frequently and violently attacked by massive, angry street mobs. The rattling wheels of a hawker's wooden barrow hastily rolled away at the first sight. They fled quickly whenever a local watchman or known informant turned the corner. The sheer and totally overwhelming volume of this massive street-level distribution was astonishing. It made it completely and physically impossible for the few local constables to police the trade. The law simply could not keep up with the endless, flowing tide of cheap gin. Unlike traditional ale taverns, which were heavily and exclusively male-dominated spaces, gin shops were different. These new establishments actively welcomed and eagerly catered directly to working-class women. They were brightly lit and warmly inviting to anyone with a single spare penny. Gin rapidly became the very first alcoholic beverage in all of English history to cross this line. It was consumed in entirely equal quantities by both men and women across the city. Many of the successful street hawkers and underground gin stall owners were actually independent women. This unique situation offered them a highly rare and deeply valuable avenue of personal independent income. They could finally earn their own money without relying on a husband or a cruel master. But the visible and public intoxication of women in these busy street spaces was deeply shocking. It completely terrified and deeply offended the highly strict patriarchal Georgian society. Women were entirely expected to remain quiet and hidden in the domestic sphere. The bright, unnatural glare of hot lanterns illuminated the crowded and noisy gin shops. These chaotic rooms were completely filled with both men and women drinking heavily together. The constant rustle of heavy worn skirts was heard everywhere in the busy streets. Female hawkers aggressively navigated the muddy and dangerous thoroughfares to sell their liquid wares. Gin was heavily and constantly blamed for women supposedly neglecting their important domestic duties. Angry politicians claimed mothers were entirely abandoning their helpless, starving children. The deeply judgmental term "mother's ruin" was quickly coined during this fearful and chaotic era. It was widely used to describe the spirit's strongly perceived destructive effect on sacred maternity. The sharp and deeply judgmental whispers of the wealthy upper classes were cruel and constant. They muttered angrily while safely passing by a loud and chaotic public house. Tragically, many pregnant women frequently drank large amounts of cheap gin to numb their hunger. They were unknowingly causing severe fetal alcohol syndrome in their unborn babies. This terrible condition was absolutely not medically understood or even recognized at the time. The helpless infants suffered terribly from the massive amounts of toxic spirits consumed. Sensationalist and highly exaggerated stories in the popular printing press fueled the growing public panic. They frequently and loudly highlighted desperate mothers committing terrible crimes to acquire more gin. The most infamous and truly horrific case was that of a woman named Judith Dufour. She tragically and violently killed her own tiny toddler in a fit of terrible, desperate madness. She committed this awful crime simply to sell the child's brand new clothes for gin money. The cheap, faded fabric of a small child's lovely garment was pawned hastily and carelessly. It was traded for a few coins at a dirty local broker's stained wooden counter. The moral panic and public outrage disproportionately and unfairly targeted poor working-class women. The wealthy politicians deeply viewed these struggling women as the primary carriers of a social contagion. They blamed them for the moral decay of the entire Grand British Empire. The harsh and stinging scent of spilled juniper spirit was completely inescapable. It mingled tragically with the damp, unwashed wool of a tired young mother's faded shawl. The rising moral outrage over horrific cases like Judith Dufour finally forced the hand of government. They felt entirely compelled to take incredibly drastic and immediate political action. The government desperately attempted to halt the massive crisis with highly aggressive new laws. In direct response to the escalating crisis, Parliament quickly passed the infamous Gin Act. This heavily debated legislation was enacted in the year 1736. The sweeping act strictly imposed a truly massive and deeply prohibitive new national tax. It demanded a shocking 20 shillings per gallon on all retail gin sales. It also strictly required all vendors to immediately purchase an outrageously expensive operating license. This new legal license cost an absolutely staggering £50 every single year. The law was very specifically and cruelly designed to make gin entirely unaffordable. They wanted to price the working class completely out of the growing alcohol market. But instead of quiet obedience, the harsh act sparked massive and immediate civil disobedience. The poor citizens absolutely refused to accept this heavy-handed and deeply unfair legislation. Only 2 totally legal £50 licenses were ever actually purchased. This was incredibly true for the entire massive and sprawling city of London. The illicit and hidden underground trade instantly exploded with massive new energy. Gin was now cleverly sold under completely new and legally evasive fake names. They boldly called it colic water to pretend it was a simple healing medicine. They cheekily referred to it as parliamentary brandy to openly mock the angry politicians. The frustrated public eagerly staged massive and elaborate mock funerals for their beloved Madame Geneva. The rhythmic and deeply thudding march of an angry mob echoed down the cobblestone streets. They angrily carried a heavy, black, draped wooden coffin right through the wealthy city streets. They were loudly and passionately protesting the deeply unfair and highly restrictive new laws. Riots broke out very frequently and with deeply terrifying and sudden explosive violence. The angry mobs specifically and viciously targeted the paid informants hired by the corrupt government. The heavy and highly authoritative slam of a wealthy magistrate's wooden gavel echoed uselessly. They were angrily passing down an entirely unenforceable and deeply foolish law. The terribly shattered glass of a government informant's front window scattered across the dirty street. It was violently broken by a heavy and jagged thrown street cobblestone. The hurried and frantic scratching of a sharp quill pen was heard in dark hidden cellars. Illicit distillers eagerly forged completely fake apothecary labels for their highly illegal spirits. The tense and deeply electric atmosphere of a crowded city square was absolutely palpable. It was the terrifying eve of a massive and violent riot against the new excise tax. By the year 1743, the exhausted British government finally admitted total defeat. They slowly realized the 1736 Act had actually massively increased illegal daily consumption. It had entirely created a massive new wave of highly dangerous organized crime. The complete failure of the 1736 Act definitively proved a very important point. It clearly showed that highly heavy-handed taxation simply would not ever work. This failure slowly set the grand stage for a completely new political approach. They desperately needed a new strategy that would finally turn the terrible tide. It is deeply fascinating how attempting to completely ban something often only makes it more desirable. The human spirit always boldly rebels against such heavy and strict control. If you were a powerful Georgian legislator during this chaotic and unprecedented time, how would you have possibly tried to solve this seemingly impossible and deeply complex puzzle? Feel free to share your wonderful thoughts and creative ideas down in the comments. I truly love reading your brilliant perspectives on these difficult historical challenges. We will now settle in deeper and watch the massive tide of history slowly begin to turn. How does a society finally step back from the brink of absolute ruin? The dark and heavy clouds that had completely smothered London for decades slowly began to break. A gentle and necessary change was finally arriving on the horizon. The great and terrible fever of the city was reaching its natural conclusion. The turning of the tide did not happen overnight. It was a slow and quiet process born from a deeply fascinating combination of art and law and nature. A profound cultural shift was about to gently sweep through the exhausted cobblestone streets. The public was growing deeply tired of the endless tragedy and chaos. They were finally ready to seek a much softer and more peaceful way of life. In the year 1751, a brilliant artist named William Hogarth stepped forward. He sought to capture the deep sorrow of the city in stark visual terms. He published two highly iconic and deeply powerful engravings. These beautiful and tragic prints were deliberately designed as brilliant public health propaganda. They were carefully crafted to strongly support a new and impending government law. The first print was famously titled Gin Lane. It depicted the horrific decay and terrible starvation caused by addiction in the St. Giles Rookery. The quiet and focused scratching of Hogarth's sharp etching needle was a deliberate act. He meticulously carved deep, precise lines into a cold and smooth copper plate. The deep and rich black ink was carefully prepared in his quiet workshop. It was pressed heavily into the coarse, cheap paper of an 18th century printing press. The central and deeply shocking image of Gin Lane was profoundly disturbing. It showed a careless and tragically afflicted mother allowing her tiny baby to tumble away. The stark and deeply unsettling sight of the tumbling child was frozen forever in time. It was captured entirely within the dark borders of the printed page. But Hogarth was a highly intelligent and deeply thoughtful man. He did not only want to show the terrible darkness of the current reality, he also wanted to offer a bright and peaceful vision of a much better future. And so he created a companion piece that was simply titled Beer Street. This second engraving stood in incredibly stark and beautiful contrast to the first. It showed happy and healthy and deeply industrious citizens thriving peacefully on traditional English ale. The imagery was heavily and carefully symbolic in every single tiny detail. It featured collapsing and ruined buildings in the background of the dark gin lane. Conversely, it showed highly prosperous tradesmen and sturdy homes in the bright Beer Street. The warm and golden hue of a frothing tankard of fresh ale was highly celebrated. It was the central focus of the happy workers resting in the detailed print. Hogarth intentionally priced these powerful prints incredibly cheaply. He wanted to ensure they could be widely and easily distributed among the lower classes. He wanted the poorest citizens to hold the thick paper in their own hands. The thoughtful and quiet murmurs of ordinary citizens filled the smoky rooms. They stood closely examining the large printed broadsheets, carefully pinned to a wooden tavern wall. These brilliant prints successfully galvanized the shifting public opinion. They effectively created a completely unified and solid moral consensus among the middle and upper classes. Hogarth was actually very friendly with a man named Henry Fielding. Fielding was a highly prominent city magistrate and a respected writer. He also campaigned tirelessly against the devastating dangers of cheap gin. Together, their combined artistic and legal efforts created a powerful cultural wave. The incredible visual power of the cheap prints slowly helped to shift the public blame. People stopped blaming the exhausted consumers and started blaming the unregulated spirit itself. Could a simple ink drawing truly change the stubborn mind of an entire nation? The unified public sentiment cultivated by Hogarth paved a clear and open path. It allowed the cautious Parliament to finally draft a much more intelligent piece of legislation. The government had finally learned a deeply valuable lesson from their past failures. They finally realized that harsh bans and impossible taxes would absolutely never work. The careful and highly deliberate Gin Act of 1751 was introduced. It was widely and commonly known as the Tippling Act by the hopeful public. This specific law is widely credited with effectively and permanently ending the London Gin Craze. Unlike the deeply failed 1736 law, this new act was incredibly smart. It absolutely did not attempt to foolishly ban the popular spirit entirely. It also completely avoided imposing impossible and punitive daily taxes on the exhausted poor. Instead, it gently and strictly regulated the complex distribution of the alcohol. It completely reformed the fundamental economic structure of the entire brewing trade. The new law strictly and clearly prohibited all large distillers from selling their liquid wares directly. They could no longer sell to unlicensed merchants or roaming street hawkers. The chaotic street-level supply chain was finally and completely severed. Official retail licenses were now only carefully granted to established and wealthy property owners. Only highly reputable and trusted tavern keepers could legally purchase the right to sell gin. The cost of this new legal license was set at exactly £10. This specific amount was highly calculated and deeply intentional. It was high enough to permanently deter the poor temporary hawkers. but it was entirely affordable for the owners of real and comfortable local pubs. The quiet and deeply satisfying thud of an official heavy wax seal echoed in the halls. It was being gently and firmly stamped onto a completely legitimate paper tavern license. This brilliant economic strategy forced the daily consumption of gin out of the dark, hidden back alleys. It brought the drinking back into highly regulated and clearly visible public houses. The slow and highly methodical closing of heavy wooden doors echoed across the city. The dangerous and illicit underground gin cellars were slowly shut down for good. The calm and deeply orderly atmosphere slowly returned to the weary city streets. A newly regulated public house on a quiet Saturday night became a place of peace. The soft rustle of dry parliamentary records officially documented the massive change. The papers noted the incredibly sharp and sudden drop in illegal street hawkers. The new act also deeply encouraged the joyful consumption of traditional beer. It did this by significantly reducing the heavy taxes on the large commercial breweries. Dedicated magistrates, like the clever Henry Fielding, were given much greater legal powers. They were finally allowed to properly enforce the law and dismantle the illegal criminal networks. The clever law had effectively and permanently cut off the vast supply chain. The most impoverished and desperate consumers simply could no longer afford the spirit. It completely transformed the chaotic process of distillation forever. It changed from a dangerous cottage industry into a capitalized and highly regulated commercial enterprise. The comforting and gentle warmth of a clean and well-lit tavern was a beautiful sight. It slowly and surely replaced the cold and terrifying darkness of the sprawling rookeries. While the new law smartly regulated the daily supply, an active nature was arriving. The fragile weather was about to drastically affect the price of the raw agricultural ingredients. In the late 1750s, the country of England experienced a deeply terrible natural event. The nation suffered through a devastating series of severe and widespread harvest failures. The delicate balance of nature shifted, and the fertile earth refused to yield its bounty. The sudden and massive scarcity of raw grain caused widespread national panic. The foundational price of simple wheat and hardy barley began to absolutely skyrocket. The cost of grain rose higher across the entire country than anyone had ever seen. To successfully prevent mass famine and violent bread riots, the government had to act. They completely and temporarily banned the distillation of all domestic grain. This highly vital and desperate ban occurred in the difficult year of 1757. The quiet and completely barren expanse of an English wheat field was a tragic sight. The empty brown stalks blew gently under a pale and unseasonably cold summer sky. The soft and dusty sweeping of a quiet mill floor became a sacred act. Every single last grain of fine flour became an incredibly precious and protected commodity. This completely natural economic shift permanently removed the absolute core incentive of the original craze. There was absolutely no more incredibly cheap surplus grain to easily boil and distill. The fundamental cost of producing the spirit soared to incredible new heights. This rapidly forced the final retail price far beyond the reach of the working poor. The cold and completely empty copper kettles of the makeshift underground stills were abandoned. They sat quietly gathering thick gray dust in the dark and damp city cellars. The gentle and highly rhythmic kneading of soft dough became the absolute national priority. Baking warm, fresh bread once again became far more important than making strong spirits. Even after the temporary ban was finally lifted, the entire agricultural landscape had permanently shifted. The raw grain never once returned to its previous artificially and dangerously low prices. The calm and quiet ledgers of a merchant documented this massive historical change. Their pages recorded the steadily rising and completely insurmountable financial costs of purchasing barley. Because the raw ingredients were now so expensive, distillers were forced to change. They had to vastly improve their brewing methods to somehow justify the new higher prices. This slow evolution eventually led to much better and significantly higher quality spirits. The terrible and tragic era of the completely unregulated and highly toxic Madame Geneva was over. It naturally and quietly withered away due to the simple fundamental laws of supply and demand. The massive urban population was permanently forced to seek out much more affordable alternatives. They desperately needed safer and warmer beverages for their daily consumption. This profound economic reality worked in absolutely perfect harmony with the smart legislative efforts. The new laws and the bad weather combined to save the struggling city. With gin slowly becoming an expensive luxury, once more the working class turned their attention elsewhere. They looked toward a completely new and deeply warming beverage arriving slowly from the east. As the sharp spirit became incredibly expensive, fine black tea became incredibly popular. It was imported in massive wooden crates by the wealthy East India Company. This dark, dried leaf became increasingly and remarkably affordable for the common working people. Tea quietly offered the exhausted working class a highly safe and deeply warm beverage. It crucially required boiling the heavily contaminated and dangerous city water to steep the leaves. This simple heating process naturally killed the terrible unseen sickness hiding in the river water. The gentle and soothing chemical properties of the tea provided a productive and calming energy boost. It contrasted incredibly sharply with the terrible, debilitating intoxication of cheap gin. The soft and soothing whistle of a small tin kettle boiling fresh, clean water was beautiful. It sang quietly over a modest and warmly glowing hearth fire in a small home. The delicate and highly aromatic steam rising from a humble ceramic cup was magical. It floated gently above the dark black tea, bringing a deep sense of absolute peace. The quiet ritual of tea drinking naturally fostered a much more domestic and peaceful social environment. Families gathered together simply to share a warm cup and quietly discuss their long day. Simultaneously, the large commercial city breweries began mass-producing a new type of ale. They created a deeply dark and highly nourishing drink, simply called porter. This rich liquid was carefully aged in truly massive wooden vats for many long months. It was highly popular with the strong physical laborers of the massive city. The deep and rich mahogany color of a freshly poured dark pint of porter was inviting. It rested heavily on a beautifully polished wooden bar waiting to be enjoyed. The steady rise of the comfortable commercial pub changed the landscape of the city. These new pubs were entirely centered around gentle communal drinking and dark ale. They successfully and permanently replaced the chaotic and highly dangerous corner gin shop. By the calm year of 1760, a true miracle had quietly occurred. The daily consumption of gin had fallen to a tiny fraction of its previous massive peak levels. The wild and terrifying days of the 1730s were finally a distant, fading memory. The quiet and deeply contented murmur of working families gathering around a sturdy wooden table returned. They sat peacefully at the end of a very long and exhausting workday. The torn and battered social fabric of London slowly and surely began to heal itself. Public health improved gently, and the tragic infant mortality rates finally stabilized and fell. The gentle and slowly fading light of the chaotic Georgian era was passing away. It was gracefully giving way to a much more orderly and highly tranquil evening. The notorious London Gin Craze quietly and softly faded away into the deep pages of history. It was permanently replaced by the incredibly industrious and structured dawn of the incoming industrial age. And so the great fever broke. The era of Madame Geneva slowly faded away into the quiet past. With all its chaotic energy and desperate sorrows and vibrant street life, it simply disappeared. It was replaced by the gentle clinking of porcelain teacups in warm, cozy parlors, the quiet and highly orderly hum of the friendly corner public house returned to the streets. The massive city had successfully weathered its very first modern storm. It emerged fundamentally changed and deeply battered, but ultimately incredibly resilient and entirely strong. As the historical dust gently settles on the quiet streets of old London, I invite you to stay. Please stay with me for just a little while longer in this peaceful space. If you are finding this quiet journey relaxing, simply close your heavy, tired eyes. Let the deep currents of history wash gently and slowly over your resting mind. In our next and final chapter, we will take a very slow and quiet step back. We will quietly reflect on the much deeper and lasting historical legacies of this remarkable time. The dust of history eventually settles over every great crisis. When the wild and chaotic energy of the London Gin Craze finally subsided, a profound stillness remained. This quiet aftermath allowed the greatest minds of the era to look back and truly reflect. They needed to deeply understand what had just happened to their grand and sprawling city. The profound legacy of this dark era extends far beyond the simple history of a popular beverage. It is widely considered by modern scholars to be one of the very first recognized urban public health crises. It occurred during the chaotic and rapidly changing dawn of modern history. This massive crisis forced a complete and total paradigm shift in government thinking. The powerful politicians were finally forced to fundamentally change how they viewed the welfare of their poorest citizens. Previously, the harsh concepts of poverty and addiction were viewed almost exclusively through a deeply religious or moral lens. The wealthy elite firmly believed that suffering was simply a sign of personal spiritual failure. They thought the poor simply lacked the necessary moral fortitude to succeed. But the devastating gin crisis definitively proved this cruel assumption was entirely wrong. It clearly demonstrated that powerful environmental factors directly and heavily influenced mass human behavior. When the dark river water was essentially poison, people naturally turned to cheap spirits simply to survive the day. The staggering and tragic infant mortality rates during the height of the craze deeply alarmed the government officials. They were not necessarily moved by simple compassion or deep empathy for the suffering mothers. They were instead highly concerned about the future strength of their vast labor and military forces. They suddenly realized they needed healthy citizens to build their empire and fight their distant wars. This cold but practical realization led to the vital establishment of early charitable hospitals. Generous and thoughtful men, like Thomas Coram, stepped forward from the quiet shadows. He worked tirelessly to create the famous Foundling Hospital to save the abandoned children of the city. The pristine and heavily starched white linen of a dedicated nurse's apron was a beautiful sight. It brought a deep sense of order and peace to the calm and quiet wards of the new hospital. The slow and deeply solemn chime of a distant clock tower echoed gently over the newly established hospital grounds. It marked the passing hours with a comforting and highly regular rhythm. During this time, local parishes began carefully and meticulously collecting massive amounts of mortality data. They needed to understand exactly how many people were dying and why they were falling ill. The quiet and highly methodical scratching of a tired parish clerk's pen filled the silent rooms. They sat at rough wooden desks, recording endless mortality statistics in heavy, dusty ledgers. This vital and deeply tedious work laid the absolute fundamental groundwork for modern demographics. It was the very quiet and uncelebrated birth of modern epidemiology and public health science. The deep and heavy parchment of early parliamentary reports contained these shocking numbers. They detailed the truly horrific living conditions of the poor in stark and undeniable mathematical terms. This massive crisis highlighted the truly desperate and immediate need for vast municipal infrastructure. The city desperately needed clean running water and safe working sewers for its massive population. This growing awareness eventually and slowly led to the massive Victorian sanitation reforms of the next century. The crisis perfectly demonstrated the highly intricate and delicate link between basic economic policy and public health. When the government artificially inflated the price of food with corn bounties, the poor suffered terribly. The historical legacy of the terrifying craze permanently intertwined to massive concepts. The grand ideas of urban planning and social welfare were forever joined together in British politics. The soft and gently filtering light of a quiet library window illuminated the slow progress of medical science. Scholars began to read the old reports and understand the deep mechanics of human society. This newfound and profound understanding of public health naturally led to a new desire. The powerful government wanted to better control and carefully refine the products the public consumed daily. They realized that unregulated and toxic alcohol was a massive danger to the stability of the entire nation. And so we quietly turn our attention to the fascinating evolution of the distillation process itself. We must explore how the end of the wildly unregulated craze led to beautiful scientific refinement. The passing of the 1751 Act fundamentally changed who was allowed to make spirits. It heavily concentrated the complex art of distilling entirely in the hands of wealthy and established commercial companies. These large and highly successful distilleries had the massive financial capital required to invest in their future. They could easily afford to fund deep scientific research and purchase vastly better brewing equipment. The early 18th century pot stills used in the dark cellars were incredibly crude and highly inefficient. They were small and dangerous and constantly left many harsh chemical congeners in the final liquid. These toxic impurities were exactly what made the early street gin so dangerous and foul-tasting. The new commercial need to produce a much cleaner and safer product drove massive engineering innovations. Brilliant engineers worked tirelessly in the late 1700s to perfect the ancient art of boiling alcohol. This long and slow period of quiet mechanical evolution eventually paved a clear path forward. It led directly to a man named Aeneas Coffey and his brilliant invention in 1831. Coffey successfully invented and patented the massive and highly complex continuous column still. The gentle and incredibly steady hum of a massive Victorian continuous still was a soothing industrial sound. It operated quietly and efficiently in the background of a large and remarkably clean brick distillery. The towering Coffey still allowed for the rapid production of a much higher proof spirit. It created a remarkably pure and completely neutral base liquid that was incredibly safe to drink. The slow and deeply mesmerizing drip of perfectly clear and purified spirit was beautiful to watch. It emerged steadily from a highly polished and completely clean copper pipe. With a perfectly clean base spirit, the modern distillers no longer needed to hide any bad flavors. They completely stopped using heavy, cheap sugars or highly dangerous turpentine in their recipes. This incredible new purity finally allowed the highly delicate flavors of true natural botanicals to shine. Master distillers began using incredibly high-quality juniper berries and fresh citrus peels. The crisp and beautifully clean scent of pure alcohol vapor filled the large working rooms. It mingled perfectly with the highly delicate and spicy aroma of freshly crushed coriander seeds. The scientific understanding of complex alcohol vaporization and rapid condensation improved dramatically during this era. The distillers learned exactly how to control the heat to extract only the finest and sweetest flavors. The cool and perfectly smooth surface of a delicate glass beaker was a tool of the trade. It was carefully used by a master distiller to constantly test the absolute purity of the daily run. This massive technological transition completely transformed distilling from a crude and dangerous backyard chemistry experiment. It slowly evolved into a highly refined and deeply respected culinary art form. The soft and warm glow of a polished brass lantern reflected beautifully off the towering copper machinery. It illuminated the highly intricate columns of the new and wonderful scientific age. This beautiful technological refinement of the spirit perfectly mirrored a much broader societal desire. The growing British Empire deeply wanted complete refinement and absolute order and strict social control. We must now quietly analyze the profound philosophical shift in modern British lawmaking. We will look closely at how the early failures and late successes of the Gin Acts taught the government. These laws taught the state exactly how to effectively use taxation and licensing to shape a better society. The chaotic Gin Acts essentially served as a massive and highly unscripted real-world experiment. It was a brutal lesson in the complex modern field of behavioral economics long before the term existed. The spectacular failure of the 1736 Act definitively proved a very simple point. It showed that complete prohibition and extreme punitive taxation absolutely only create dangerous black markets. When you make something illegal, you simply hand the profitable trade over to violent street criminals. It clearly demonstrated that strict laws completely lacking basic public consent are fundamentally unenforceable. It absolutely does not matter how incredibly harsh or severe the legal penalties might be. If the common people do not respect the law, they will simply find a way to break it. The quiet and distant echo of footsteps in the empty, marbled halls of a sleeping courthouse reminds us. It reminds us of the countless failed judges who tried to stop the massive tide with a tiny gavel. But the beautiful success of the 1751 Act established a completely new legal paradigm. It created the highly effective modern template for all future global alcohol regulation. This new template relied entirely on strict commercial licensing and very moderate, reasonable taxation. It showed the learning governments that carefully controlling the massive supply chain is the key. Regulating the wealthy wholesalers is infinitely more effective than cruelly punishing the desperate end consumer. This fascinating era sparked intensely passionate and deeply intellectual philosophical debates across the country. Scholars argued constantly about the exact proper limits of heavy state intervention in personal, private lives. The heavy and beautiful velvet-bound volumes of legal philosophy rested quietly on a polished mahogany library desk. Their thick pages contained the deeply thoughtful arguments of the greatest minds of the Georgian era. Famous writers and strict magistrates, like Henry Fielding, argued a highly controversial and paternal point. He strongly believed that the wealthy state had an absolute moral and paternal duty to protect the working poor. He thought they needed to be legally protected from their own destructive personal vices. The slow and highly deliberate turning of a thick parchment page echoed softly in a quiet, shadowy study. The soft and gently fading embers of a warm fireplace cast a beautiful orange glow. It illuminated a tired magistrate's thoughtfully penned notes regarding the nature of human freedom. These quiet and profound debates echoed loudly into the bustling 19th and 20th centuries. They heavily influenced massive and sweeping later temperance movements worldwide. The modern and highly recognizable concept of the sin tax was firmly and permanently solidified right here. This is the careful practice of heavily taxing harmful goods to actively discourage their daily use. It also brilliantly raises massive amounts of revenue for the state government at the exact same time. The gentle settling of tiny dust motes danced slowly in a single shaft of warm afternoon sunlight. This peaceful light illuminated the massive silent archives where these vital foundational laws were kept. The highly effective legal framework established in 1751 was a masterpiece of social engineering. It remained the absolute bedrock foundation of British licensing law for well over an entire century. As the complex laws modernized and the spirit was scientifically purified, gin itself underwent a dramatic change. It experienced a massive and highly successful public image rehabilitation across the entire Grand Empire. We will now gently conclude our long historical journey by tracing the incredible final path of the spirit. We will follow its slow journey from the dark, muddy gutters of the terrifying St. Giles Rookery. We will watch it transform into the incredibly sophisticated and deeply refined London dry style. By the middle of the industrious 19th century, the drinking habits of the nation had changed again. The harsh and heavily sweetened Old Tom style of early gin was finally replaced. It was completely overtaken by the incredibly crisp and wonderfully clean London Dry, True London. Dry gin contains absolutely no hidden added sugar or cheap artificial chemical sweeteners. It relies entirely on the absolute highest quality botanical infusion for its remarkable and complex flavor. During this time, the vast British Empire was expanding heavily into incredibly hot tropical climates. The colonial administrators and soldiers desperately needed to protect themselves from the deadly threat of malaria. The highly brilliant invention of carbonated tonic water provided a perfect medical solution. Tonic water contained a heavy dose of natural medicinal quinine, which actively prevented the terrible fever. But the raw natural quinine was incredibly bitter and highly unpleasant to drink on its own. The thirsty soldiers quickly discovered that mixing the bitter tonic with the crisp, new, dry gin was perfect. The harsh medicinal taste was completely smoothed out by the complex botanical spirit. And so the famous gin and tonic was happily and quite accidentally born in the distant tropical colonies. It rapidly became the absolute quintessential and highly sophisticated beverage of the entire British Empire. The sharp and wonderfully refreshing fizz of carbonated tonic water was a delightful new sound. It mingled perfectly with heavy, clear ice in a beautiful and heavy crystal highball glass. Gin was finally and completely rehabilitated in the highly judgmental eyes of the strict public. It moved entirely away from being a tragic and shameful symbol of desperate urban poverty. It became a shining and wealthy symbol of upper-class refinement and global imperial elegance. Back in the bustling heart of London, the old and grimy street corner gin shops were torn down. They were rapidly replaced by the incredibly opulent and wildly extravagant Victorian gin palaces. The sparkling and highly brilliant reflection of bright gaslight danced across the massive rooms. It reflected beautifully against the highly intricate and deeply frosted mirrors of a massive gin palace. These grand and wealthy establishments featured vast expanses of deeply polished dark mahogany wood. The gentle and highly satisfying clink of a heavy silver spoon was heard constantly in these bright rooms. It was gracefully stirring a perfectly balanced and deeply botanical cocktail for a wealthy patron. The slow and cool condensation naturally formed on the smooth outside of a beautifully chilled glass. It was a perfect and highly refreshing comfort on a warm and deeply quiet summer evening. Today, the modern world is happily experiencing a massive and highly creative global renaissance. There are thousands of brilliant small craft distilleries operating in almost every single country on Earth. They focus intensely on foraging highly unique and perfectly fresh local botanicals for their recipes. The fragrant and incredibly complex bouquet of fresh juniper and sweet citrus peel is celebrated. It wafts gently and beautifully from the open neck of a perfectly designed modern craft bottle. Modern craft distillers very often look deep into the past Georgian era for their historical inspiration. They love the rich history and the romantic aesthetic of the old recipes and ancient methods, but they thankfully leave the highly toxic elements and the desperate urban tragedy far behind them. The incredibly resilient spirit that once very nearly broke the greatest city in Europe survived. It is now widely considered one of its most universally celebrated and heavily exported cultural icons. The long and truly strange historical journey of gin perfectly encapsulates something very beautiful. It perfectly mirrors the highly dynamic and ever-changing and deeply resilient nature of human civilization. And so the long and winding story of Madame Geneva finally transforms completely. It changes slowly from a chaotic and deeply sorrowful urban tragedy into a beautiful testament. It becomes a shining testament to incredible human ingenuity and slow, deliberate social progress. From the incredibly murky and dark depths of the polluted River Thames to the bright modern world, it now rests peacefully in the incredibly crystal-clear botanicals of a heavy modern glass. It is a quiet and beautiful reminder that even our very darkest historical chapters eventually pass. They always yield softly to the slow and incredibly steady forward march of time and human refinement. As the heavy and deeply weathered history books gently close for the quiet night, there is absolutely no more need to study and no more complex facts to try and remember. The lesson is completely over, and the difficult historical journey is finally done. Please allow your busy and tired mind to simply drift entirely away.